Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Dare to Teach talks. We are talking now as we try to define the integral teacher, and we are now going to work with the concept of discipline. Now, my assumption is that you have been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, the Dare to Discipline playlist. We have two introductory set of lectures. I'm going to assume that you've watched. And we've already dealt with two groups of four of these core concepts as I've been speaking of them as it relates to the integral teacher. In that first group, honesty, forgiveness, freedom, and love, compassion. In the second group, we talked about justice, hope. We talked about the role of courage, joy, and then our last conversation was about peace. Now, it is possible that we have, you could argue, we've been intentionally somewhat philosophic or esoteric as we've talked about these different elements of the integral teacher. And now in this last four, we are going to turn to a little bit more pragmatic, although we're not going to leave our conversation in philosophy because I think it's central to our understanding of what's going on. But we're going to talk now about discipline, then we're going to talk about purity or intentionality, and then we're going to talk about grace, mercy, and then finally gratitude. Now, as we have been doing throughout all of these conversations, notice, I continue to redefine language to suit our purpose, and we're obviously going to play that game here as well. Maybe we would say I like to expand the definition. For example, watch this. So we will say often about athletes, wow, they're very disciplined because they train every day. That is to say, there's this thing called will, I want to train, and then there's this thing called sustained will. In other words, I will do it regularly with some intentionality. Now, although we're going to talk about intentionality when I reference the concept of purity in the next talk, that is not what I am meaning here when I talk about discipline. A disciplined teacher is not a teacher who continues to do the same thing over and over again for a prolonged period of time till the end of his or their career. No. That is not how we will define discipline here. I love that. Remember that line from St. Augustine's Confessions, by the way, a text that I always recommend to first-year teachers that they read, and read closely. All of the big five, as we have talked about them, are there expressed powerfully in Augustine's Confessions. Do you remember when he said, Lord, give me discipline, but not yet? Now, when we talk about discipline, and I'm borrowing now to some degree from Augustine, when we talk about discipline, there's no question, there is a level of assiduity, that ability to continue. That is to say, almost like guts of a kind, as we talk about athletes and musicians, you know, they have that discipline. But the key, as we're going to define discipline as integral teachers, is the question, why? Now, stay with me here. I hope that I am challenging you to take a little bit of a risk, the fallibilist epistemological position to say, wow, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. I'm going to challenge you a little bit here. So for me, I think of discipline as this: consistent, critical introspection that seeks to answer the question, who am I or why am I? And also wants to challenge students to play the same game. Who are you, or why are you? Now, I want to point out, this question of why are you as a teacher takes us all the way back to our opening comments about honesty. When I have conversations with teachers, especially teachers who are in that range of the I don't know if I can stick this out range, usually it starts at, well, it's funny, I used to see it starting at year 7, then it went to year 5, now I'm seeing it increasingly at year 3, where I'll have these conversations with younger teachers and they will begin to say, man, I'm just not sure I'm cut out for this. And one of the central questions they really struggle to answer is, why do you ever do this in the first place? Can you articulate that with some better answer than, I wanted to, save one life, or, some of these other cliched comments that sometimes come up as it relates to teaching. Like, why did you decide to become a teacher in the first place? This will be for us the question. This will be the question of discipline, the challenge of discipline. Now, notice, this definition of discipline is both dynamic and evolving. That is to say, it's integral, right? Because, why? Well, there is no magic formula. Hey, you guys, this is crucial. There's no magic formula that's, if I could only just figure out how to do this classroom gig to be this teacher, then all I got to do is just continue to do it year after year until I retire, 30 plus years later. No. This is not. Now, I will say that it's possible to make the argument that there was a generation when you could be a teacher, invent what you did well, and then somehow just continue to do it year after year and be effective. Those days are long gone. Why? Because of student populations. So it's here that we're going to have to talk a little bit about what's going on with our students, because clearly that dynamic has changed. There's no question about that. Now, integral teachers realize that they have to evolve because students are evolved. And therefore, about any action in the classroom, they are willing to ask and try to answer, why am I still doing this? One of my favorite challenges in room 303, and I will make it every year to my students because it keeps me honest, is to say, hey, fellas, if I asked you to do anything in 303 and you don't think it's a good idea, then you have the right to challenge me as to why it is I'm asking you to do this. And if I can't give you a good reason, and no, just because I said so is not a good reason. Okay, now I understand that often elementary teachers, we are placed as elementary teachers in a position of authority where we have to say, do it because I told you to. But by the time we're working in the secondary program and then on into the university, I will say it this way. If I can't convince a student to try with me some idea, some concept, some pedagogic approach, then I drop it. I drop it. I either drop it for the student or I drop it for the whole group. Okay? Now, I realize that is a risk. No, but I told you guys, good teachers take risks. And so here's my argument. If I can't convince a student that what I'm asking that student to do makes real pedagogic sense in the life of that student, and don't just give me that, someday in the future you're really going to appreciate that I made you do this. If I can't give a legitimate reason right here, right now for that student, then I don't do it. I don't demand that the student does it. I don't demand that these students do it. And is it possible that over the years in 303, students have challenged me to say, I can't buy in to the argument that you're making. I have to say, all right, students, it may be I may have a dynamic argument as to why I'm asking students to do it. But if they don't accept it, and see, this is where, again, the transition is happening for us with the student demographic. We're going to talk about that in a second. Then I have to admit that I'm going to have to make some adjustments. I either have to get rid of it or I have to adapt it and change it. Why? Because students have a say. Remember, I said our three order of concerns, those three perspectives are first of all teacher, then students, and then those outside the classroom. But it is all dynamic, it's symbiotic. And to that degree, as a disciplined teacher, I have to be willing to ask the simple question, why? Now, where did I come to this idea? Well, I came into 303 for what I thought was to be a year of research in my ed psych background. But right away, I wanted to talk to a number of the teachers in this building and outside of this building in other districts. I had the opportunity to travel internationally, so I was working elsewhere in other schools overseas. And so every teacher that I met who had taught at least 20 years, I was really excited. And I said, great, I got 3 questions for you. Can I ask you 3 questions? They were always like, yeah, sure. I found that teachers who have been doing this for 20 years or more, they love the fact that they are asked, questions about, hey, can you tell me, can you inform me in some way, help me find some wisdom? So I asked 3 questions. First question ended up just being, and obviously rhetorical, it gets dark at night, obvious, but I asked them, are students changing, and have they changed over the last 20 years? And again, usually teachers just kind of laugh that I would even ask, you obviously haven't been in a classroom, ha ha ha, that kind of thing. But the second question that I asked was, in what ways are they different? Can you be specific? I mean, yeah, of course, everything changes. Of course, we understand the concept of modernity, and then, of course, later post-modernity, and then now post-modernity. So, yeah, everything changes. But can you be specific as to the ways in which they're changing? And it seemed that these answers seem to collate predominantly around the issue of authority and respect for authority. So, for example, teachers and coaches would say things to me like, yeah, so when I first started this, I could tell the student do X, Y, Z, and they just do it because I was the teacher and they were the student, but not anymore. So, I'm asking this question in the early 90s and even earlier in the late 80s, and I was already getting these kinds of answers. It was the third question that would often leave them kind of cautiously silent, and I would ask them, what are the causes, do you think, of this change? And obviously they could talk to me about cultural challenges and the like. it would be many years later that I would come to Ken Wilber's integral philosophy, where that 4 quadrants, where I could ask, how are students changing in the upper right quadrant? That is to say, biologically, our students are changing. That is absolutely true. We know that is true. They are definitely changing in the upper left quadrant in terms of their spiritual, psychological, mental development, cognitive development. They are for sure changing in that lower left quadrant. Obviously, technology plays a huge role in this lower left as well as lower right quadrant. So I began myself to become very interested, and I knew that I was teaching in a different time, in a different era. I had been in 303 for at least 10 years when Steve Spielberg released Saving Private Ryan. Now, I was sitting in a group of AP students. They were our brightest students of our school, and I've told this story a number of times because for me, it's compelling. It tells me something about what I recognized in that first decade of teaching. And I'm talking about Saving Private Ryan. I'm hoping that you as you instructors have seen this film. Although it's dated, it's a majestic film. It's a remarkable film. It's a film that I think needs to be seen, and so we were talking about it. It had just been released, and I was asking a number of my students about the film. They had all seen the film, and I was impressed. Wow, you've seen the film. That's awesome. I said, let's talk about this film as it relates to the text we were studying at the time, especially the Iliad and the Aeneid. Is Saving Private Ryan in the vein of Homer's Iliad, a celebration of war, or is it in the vein of Homer's Iliad, a denigration of war? And it shows the horrors of war. Like, where do you guys come down on this? And what about the heroes that are portrayed, especially in those first 20 minutes? Isn't that an amazing thing? And I noticed there was a certain kind of energy in the room, and I try, as I've said in earlier lectures, to be a reader of energy. And so I said, what's going on, guys? And everybody looked at the class, at the room captain, as I call them in my room, who just happened to be as well the senior class president and a very beloved figure in their class. And I said, what's going on? And he said, hey, Mr. McGee, I don't want to be disrespectful, but here's the thing. We really don't see those guys in those boats who are having those bullets shot into them as heroic. And it was in this moment, I have to be honest, that I was truly stunned. And so much so that I contested the student right away. I said, are you out of your ever-loving mind? What are you talking about? The bullets are raining down on them, and those fellas are in that boat. Are you kidding me? And the student said, no, you don't understand, Mr. McGee. That's just not how. And then he said it. We see it. I said, what do you mean we see it? He said, yeah, we just don't see it that way. We realize that the film is made, and to be historically accurate, is portraying for us the sacrifices of those guys in the boats. But here's the thing for us. We kind of see them as pathetic because they were lied to. They were told half-truths or untruths, and they were in those boats, and they didn't have any other choice. But the reality is we kind of see them as sad and pathetic. And then I looked around the room to see that most of the students were in fact nodding. And it was in this moment that I said to myself, and then I would write quite a bit about this and speak quite a bit about this after the fact. So here I was in this pivotal moment where I could either come after these students and talk about their lack of patriotism and in that regard just drive them further and further away from me. Or I could begin to try to have some discipline in my room, to ask the question, wow, why? Why do these students see it this way? Well, I think this is why I began to ask and try to define students from a different perspective. I think I've already said a couple of years later, after '98 in the Spielberg film, it would be the Dalai Lama, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, who would comment in Ethics for the New Millennium that this dynamic of student are going to be radically different from the students before in terms of the way they would develop their ethical understandings. And sure enough, I began to talk about the students that I was working with. I used different terms for it, but one of those terms was the spiritual semi-nomadic student. The loss of 3 institutions of stability, and I say loss, it's probably not loss, it's just simply that it was an adaptation. It was a change. It was a change for sure. Family, religion, and state, or schools and state politics in general. And that is to say, I'm not going to get into a lot of this detail here, but I will just simply say it this way. I found those students increasingly skeptical about truth and truth-keeping in all 3 of those areas, right? That is to say, they increasingly defined issues of family and sexuality radically different. They, for sure, defined issues of ethics as it related to morality and religion radically different, and the state as well, and especially schools. And about all of that, I said, students are more sophisticated. I've used this term several times, and a number of you have challenged me on it. What do you mean by sophisticated? You talking about they're smarter? Are you talking about they're wiser? Like, what do you mean by sophisticated? What I mean here is they have, they long for honesty, but they sneer at the possibility of it. That is to say, they're more jaded. Can I say it that way? They're more jaded. They're more skeptical. About everything, they are more jaded. Now, this is not to say that students have all the answers. I firmly do not believe that they do, but I have made the argument that they've heard all the answers, and they often find them lacking. Okay, and this is why I think the Ethics for the New Millennium text that I was speaking of in regards, even though it's an old text, I think it's worth going back and looking at it again, because the Dalai Lama is arguing that the role of the teacher in the classroom has got to shift to not just be a distributor of knowledge, as we have said, our 3Ds, but a developer and a destroyer as well. And obviously we're having this conversation for that reason. Now, evolution, of course, is all about transcend and include. And the Wilberian philosophy of integralism is obviously about transcend and include as well. And there's no question. We can always point at technology and say, well, technology has everything to do with what's going on in terms of our student demographic changing. But this is why I make the argument that this is the hardest time ever in the history of education to be a teacher. And this is also why I say that the new is the new. The N-E-W is the K-N-E-W. Again, back to our Augustine. Notice I began this lecture with the old thinker Augustine. I believe we have to know the ancient answers. Some have called it the classics. We have to know the ancient answers so that we can transcend and include those and help our students to do the same. In other words, can I answer the question why I continue to do what I do in a classroom? Can I redefine the concept of discipline as something other than just simply doing something over and over again, to having an informed decision as to exactly why? For example, within my Big Five, as it relates to my three of myself, my students, and those outside my classroom. Can I epistemologically continue to ask why I hold the epistemological positions that I hold? In other words, it's one thing to say I think I'm right, but I could be wrong, but do I actually play the game of that? Ontologically, do I continue to ask, who am I, both as body, mind, and spirit? And do I continue to transcend and include and evolve in those regards? Obviously, the perspective of psychology and sociology. Do I continue to ask the questions of why? Why do I continue to have certain kinds of motivations in my classroom? Should I begin to kind of alter those, especially sociologically, as I think it through? And then finally, obviously, the theodicy question. Is it possible for me to come to the why is this happening for me? That's a compelling idea for me personally, as well as teacher, as well as my students. I remember having this conversation, just to finish now, I remember having this conversation with a student. And he was telling me all the things that he no longer believed in. This and this and this and this. And I was like, yep, there it is. Spiritually semi-nomadic student, not a shock. And he finally finished and he thought he had like knocked me down. And I said, great, so now you've told me everything you don't believe in. That's awesome. I got it. Now, what do you believe in? And I want you to be exact. I want you to be exact. I want you to be as concrete and as exact in your telling me what you believe in as what you just told me that you don't believe in. And then more importantly, and this is for me second, as teacher, as developer and destroyer, I want you to tell me specifically how you're going to make those things come to fruition. I mean, we would all love to live in a world where everybody loves everybody, of course, come on. But I want to know what you really believe in. And then tell me how you're going to live that out in your life, how you're going to make those things a reality to the people around you. This intentionality of purpose, I call purity in the classroom, and we'll have more to say about that in our next talk. So it's at this point that I dare you to be disciplined as we're finishing. And in your teacher's learning journals, I would challenge you to think about a time that you were disciplined. That is to say, you really did ask the question of why, and you knew why you were doing the things that you did. And then, of course, we always have to finish by challenging ourselves. What's a time in the classroom, and it may be for you right here, right now, when you're performing and behaving, but you're not exactly sure as to why. You know what I'm saying? It's like not completely clear, and you're not sure anymore why you're doing the things that you're doing. If we're doing anything, it's my hope that we are challenging you to think again about why you do the things you do in a classroom. Thank you.